Welcome to another episode of GUR Cafe. I'm your host, Lainey Dixon. We have part 2 today of our methods episode with Sebastian Long. We will be concluding our conversation that we started in part 1 of this series about what it can look like to move beyond the methods toolkit and shift our focus as researchers on the outcomes instead. What does that mean for us and how can we achieve it? Well, stay tuned if you want to learn more. Seb gives us a great overview to get caught up, so I'm not going to waste any more time. We have a lot to talk about, so grab your favorite drink and let's jump right into today's episode. Here we are, part 2. We are resuming the conversation. Seb is still here. If you're joining us only now, please go back and read. Maybe don't read, listen to part 1, where we're really talking about kind of the initial steps of talking about methods. So you'll probably get some really great information if you only listen to this episode, but definitely recommend going back and visiting that first one, but then coming back and listening to us here. I gave you a couple of minutes because we've still just been chatting this whole time. So Seb, can you give us a little bit of a rundown of kind of what we talked about in episode part 1 of this?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for that. All right. So in the first section, we talked about why people can get hung up on methods. So why it is that method seems to dominate the conversation and the mindset of especially early career researchers. And we quickly moved on to why that can become a problem and how the getting hung up on methods is a real risk to the quality of the work you're doing. And I propose that the standard methods are a bit too rigid and they might not meet the team's context. Methods are quite monocular, which is to say that they only really laser focus on one particular portion of the game or one type of fun or friction, which can be a risk if we haven't looked at other parts. Methods can also be a bit monolithic, which is to say they don't feel like they can be stopped if they've started, but in actual fact, we do need to retain some of that agility. So those are all quite operational things. And the last things were a bit more political or socio-political, which is about winning credibility with the team. Methods will only get you so far in winning the trust of your colleagues. You have to be in the room and listening and a participant and various other things, which is much more than methods allows you to do. We both agreed that methods aren't the most important or powerful thing you can do as a researcher. In fact, increasingly as your career progresses, you're going to have many more conversations about research and things we should and shouldn't do rather than actually doing it. So 100%. It's important not to get too stuck up on methods. And lastly, that if you're too hung up on executing methods, standard methods, then huge global events like the pandemic or even just changes to the team's size or budgets can really pull the rug out from underneath you. So you've got to be careful not to get too stagnant thinking about methods. All right.
Thank you. That was a great recap. Highly recommend still going back and checking out that episode because obviously there was a lot more conversation than like that 2-minute recap, but it was really good. So we wanted to move into kind of a little bit of a continuation of that, right? So kind of all of those things you were discussing, really talking about assessing the risks of kind of the product or the game that we're working on. It's really looking at kind of what's important of communication, right? It's thinking beyond just kind of we're looking at the methods, we're an active participant in conversations, we're really leveraging communications with our team. It's not being super prescriptive, it's helping us be very agile, and all of those things are helping us kind of how we start to think beyond our work as the base being the methods. So want to throw the question out as the continuation of all of this. So what does it look like when we do move beyond thinking about the confines of the method as kind of our primary piece of our toolkit?
Really great. So in the last episode, you talked about having that it is a realization. You do get to a point in your career where you're like, I
100%.
do not think I can move any further forward just by being better at executing research. I'm as good as I need to be, and conversations change. And so for me, I'm doing this a lot. I'm getting myself into teams that, because of the way that player research works, alongside a lot of different and diverse development teams, I'm finding myself, being chucked into these development environments and very quickly having to pick up, well, what does a team need? What helps them drive the product forward today? What are the risks that are being talked about, ones that are being socialized among the team? But maybe more importantly, what are the risks that are not being socialized among the team? Like, are there still risks to this product that the team haven't considered or are overlooking, or maybe have assumptions about, that might actually be a better use of research time than the method that's being discussed? So there's a couple of assumptions already. I think it's inherent to the point you made in the last episode about you do have to put in your 10,000 hours really before you get to this point. You're probably already an expert in executing the core methods in games user research. But you also have some sense, I suspect, of the limitations of those methods. You're curious, you've experimented with them, you've tried things, they've worked, they haven't worked. And you talked about the profound experience in the last episode about the diary study that had to be carefully re-engineered halfway through to make sure it was delivering value. And those are really formative experiences in working out this sort of where the conversation about method stops and about risks can start. For me, that if there's one question or mindset or thing that happens to you that typifies this transition, it's when a team comes to you and says, hey, we'd love to do this method, and your instant reaction is actually no. Can we start off by talking about what you want to know and why?
Yes.
And
why is this information helpful right now?
Exactly.
How do you plan on using it?
Exactly. And that's then, of course, you would have had to build some credibility with the team for them to answer that question. Of course, it's inherent. But at that point, you're starting your journey towards saying, understanding the risk of the product might not be the surface level, but something a little deeper.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I've built I have my own sort of mental model. It doesn't replace methods at all, but it sort of sits alongside methods to make sure that we're assessing the risks that a product can have. It's not a unique mental model to me. There are similar ideas from IDEO and in the Double Diamond theory and all that sort of stuff, and various project management. But for me, this is the one that stands up. It's just four simple phrases. What are we going to use the data for? Four simple phrases that help me work out the kind of methods that we need to answer, but more importantly, the outcomes. What are the outcomes that this piece of research should achieve? Because sometimes they don't look like the ones that are initially asked for.
Well, elevating your knowledge, right? I think one thing we were talking about in the break, kind of in between these two episodes, was thinking, okay, you're kind of going from executing, you're going from thinking about the methods, and now we're elevating things to being much more strategic. It's being much more strategic in the approach of how we think about what we're delivering, why we're doing that thing, and kind of how it can provide that impact for the team. And you are thinking more about, like you said, that outcome rather than just the means at which we get that information.
So I posit there are four key outcomes, I think, and most research, most teams that come to speak to me, or in research projects I've been involved in, they tend to slot into one of these four outcomes. Either teams want to be inspired. They want to know more about, which is to say they want to know more about their player. They want to do some discovery type research or their competitors. So they want to be inspired, or they want to be validated, just to say they want to make the best bet. They want to have some alignment on a particular choice. That could be a choice about green lighting a whole product, or it could be about a control scheme or something else. So they want to be validated. Or they want to accelerate development, which is to say they just want to make choices faster and prove what they've done is good and move on. Or they want to polish, which is to say they've made 99% of all the choices and invested 99% of all the money they're going to into this product, but they've got that 1% to make some small changes that they hope to have big and substantial impact. And so, very simple: inspiration, validation, acceleration, or polish. This model is a reflection of what we internally call the voices of games user research. And so these are the different sort of personas that user research data can occupy in the boardroom, and the different purposes of that play research exists, games user research exists. Why is this important? Firstly, because if the team has to agree on what they want the outcome to be. you can't have all of these things. You can't be both polish and validate at the same time. You can't be inspired and accelerate at the same time. You have to roughly agree on what the outcome should be of this research, which helps design that research in a way that's resilient to change, resilient to the needs of the team. We already talked about that. It's, if you get too hung up on methods, you can divorce it from context, from the team's context. Going through this, what are we here for, mental exercise, makes it very much less likely that's going to happen. Are we here to be, do you want to be inspired? Do you want to be validated? Do you want to try and push development forward, or are you trying to polish this thing? And that already shaves off a load of outcomes that would be inappropriate for the project.
Yeah, and I think it creates a really interesting mindset of kind of collaboration towards let's figure out where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just like, well, we gave you the research and you made these decisions and blah blah blah. It's really kind of having that alignment, which I think is always really important, and it really can kind of help elevate, right? Like all of these things are, you've put in the time, you've built up that credibility by doing that real formative research of really thinking about those methods, and now it's saying, how do we expand the value and the impact that we can provide.
Absolutely.
And I think this voices of research, which we've talked about again off and on for quite some time now, since you kind of initially were chatting with me about this, and I think it's a super powerful way to approach this kind of problem space, or this kind of collaboration and alignment with your partners, and thinking that it's not about asking the questions to understand which method you should use, right? It's like, well, how many players should we have, blah blah blah, like this and this and this. It's really trying to, it creates a really interesting opportunity to me, because I think it allows you to be that expert. It puts your expertise and your knowledge at the forefront, because you're being curious as to what the potential risks are and how you can help them feel confident, right?
Absolutely.
It's about giving them information to make decisions and feel confident in them. We may not always agree, but that's for them to make those decisions. But being able to kind of flip that mindset, this is so powerful in kind of that build and progression.
I think so. I use this mindset. I use this mental model. This is how I think about the type of research that teams ought to be commissioning and running. And you're absolutely right to assert that these are risks. Now, I didn't frame them as risks. They're not negatively framed, right? Inspire, accelerate, validate. They're very positively framed. But if you turn them upside down, they are risks to why a game doesn't succeed. So inspiration research, if our intent is to invest in inspiration, mitigates a lack of novelty, or teams not really aligning on what they want or who their players are, right? And they're building something disparate of what their players are playing today, or what they love, right? So the risk is that they make something that's either not novel or not wanted. But we combat that with inspiration. If we do the same for validation, there's a huge risk to just backing the wrong horse, just putting all our chips on the wrong bet and getting it wrong. When we invest in that with research with the intent to validate, to say, okay, well, actually, we're going to invest in running the piece of research that's necessary to make sure we back the right horse, so we make the big bet on the right thing. And as I say, that can be a whole game, green light processes, or it can be a small choice like a control scheme, or a level, or even the song that gets put in the trailer or whatever, something relatively small. Acceleration is all about having a great idea but not being able to execute on it. So if theoretically there's a bit of an order of operations here, of course, if you as I've been working through, that we've backed the right horse, but when we've got the great idea, but now we need to make sure we execute on it. So that's what acceleration research is all about. And then lastly, on polish, which is, of course, the majority of the experience comes together in the sort of 2 minutes to midnight phase of game development. And so we need to make sure that we're mitigating the risk that our product is good but not perfect, or good but has major craters in it somehow. So yeah, these are aspirational but reflective of real risks to product design, which I think is a really nice and powerful lens.
100%. And I think it's interesting, because I've been thinking about this a lot since the first time I think we chatted about this some time ago. But I think it's an interesting way to kind of, again, elevate your positioning as a researcher, create that alignment, and really cement that kind of, I'm going to say bond for lack of a better word, but like I think sometimes it's very easy for us to kind of disconnect ourselves from like we just do the research and we just deliver this thing and like it's on them and it's kind of just like we just drop this piece of research at their door and walk away. And in the end, like we all want to see this thing succeed. And I
Absolutely.
think when we start to use common language,
Hmm.
we want to do this, our product, this, and we're kind of starting to combine and really bring together these two levels of expertise, and that it's not that we're kind of in the background supporting, it's that
Hmm.
we are collaborating, we are aligned. And I think this mindset is a really interesting one to generate conversation around what a team needs.
Absolutely.
Also assessing for ourselves, have we already evaluated these outcomes or
Hmm.
risks,
Hmm.
and how can we help provide support? Because maybe it's that the team comes to us and they're asking specific questions and we can identify that, hey, you know what, actually maybe we need to go back and we kind of think about more kind of inspirational
Hmm.
types of
Hmm.
research versus maybe them thinking that they want more this kind of validation piece. It's
Hmm.
like, okay, well, where are we at? What are the types of decisions? And it forces you to think more about all of those different elements within the problem space rather than jumping right into kind of the comfort of the research zone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're perfectly right. These risks don't go away just because the team stops talking about them. I think
Yes.
that's the importance here. Like these are all real, enormous risks to the quality of the thing that we're collectively making. And just because you're not asking about them anymore because you're working on level design on a Wednesday doesn't mean that we haven't already backed the wrong horse, or that it's actually something more substantial or foundational here that I should be spending my time as a researcher evaluating. And we'll get to this, we'll get to the polish and acceleration stuff later. So yeah, really important to and this gives you a sort of holistic top-down view of, okay, we've got 10 chips to spend, however much money on research, where we're going to put those chips, rather than thinking about time or the particular quarters or months or whatever of our project. We're thinking about abstract risk, and we're going to put some chips on inspiration, some of those chips on validation, some on acceleration, and some on polish, etc. And we're being more maybe holistic and realistic about the types of research that our fantastic research teams should be conducting. So yeah, I think it's a useful model.
And I think it's interesting because sometimes it feels very daunting for some folks when they're like, well, now I got to think strategically, like I got to do this thing completely different. And it's like, it is a different skill set to
Mhm.
really hone and develop, but it doesn't negate everything that you've already built.
Mhm.
It's only successful when you have that base of foundations and you're really
Absolutely.
understanding how to apply the methods within these different areas. You
Absolutely.
have to have both pieces. And so I think it's sometimes feels very like, well, now you tell me I have to do a completely different job. Like
Hmm.
I've had this conversation with multiple people and it's like,
Hmm.
well, no, because you've mastered this thing.
Hmm.
If you want to increase to level up, I think you mentioned it. I'm not sure if it was in this conversation or the one we just had. There are people who want to just stay in the research. They just
Hmm.
want to stay at that level. They just want to be able to deliver and they want to deliver really high quality research, and that's
Hmm.
fantastic. It's difficult when people are at that point and they start to get frustrated that they're
Hmm.
not progressing or their research is not having kind of broader impacts or what have you. It's that next transition, and it's
Absolutely.
you have to have 100% a respect for the methods and how to apply them and when they're appropriate and not appropriate to
Hmm.
be able to really elevate yourself to this. I think for me, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, it is a little bit more of kind of a strategic
Oh yeah,
way
for
of
sure.
thinking because you're still doing the same foundations. It's
Hmm.
just you're understanding this problem space. You're maybe taking a different approach. You're maybe applying methods and you're mixing methods in a different kind of novel way, but they're stacked. They're not isolated from one another.
Absolutely. Moreover, by sort of elevating up, I don't know, from, getting that sort of 100,000-foot view. I'm sounding like a very buzzwordy guy, and I regret that, but we'll keep with the elevation metaphor for a second. As you float up the business and you're starting to worry about, are we making the best game we can? There's loads of allies. Like, you're suddenly going to find loads of new allies. Inside each of these purposes or outcomes are a bunch of other departments, a bunch of other professionals, a bunch of other people that really care about each of these things as well. And increasingly, people higher and higher up the pecking order that can make, bigger decisions. You're going to be aligning yourself with them, rubbing shoulders with them, influencing their decisions too. But it requires this move away from methods and the nitty gritty, up and up and up towards the gross responsibility to making a good game, a holistically good game, and drifting upwards and upwards. So yes, it's scary, and yes, it requires a lot more knowledge and about all sorts of different disciplines. But at every stage, you'll find new allies, new professionals working in adjacent disciplines, and a lot of very passionate people who share your exact objective to inspire, validate, accelerate, and polish this incredible thing that we're making together. So it's not all bad. It's tough, but it's it's not all bad.
Well, I think it's interesting because you kind of move from this point of this kind of internal common shared language among researchers
Mm-hmm.
to a common shared terminology and approach with all of the different partners.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were saying, whether it be those working directly within a production that you may be embedded in, all the way up to kind of more business folks or business partners, in being able to really understand where a lot of people will go wrong at times is it's like, I'm going to take 2 steps back because my thoughts were ahead of me, but it's this idea of like when you're in academia and you're at a poster session.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, come see my poster, and you have your poster on the wall and everybody comes by and you're like, come care about my thing, and you're showing them and you're talking about it and they're like, yeah, that's super cool, and then they kind of carry on with their day. Sometimes we make the mistake of presenting our findings like that.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, so everybody come over and like see this cool thing that I did.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, you're speaking in a language that maybe they don't understand. It's either too technical, it's, you're speaking about kind of these methods that are our language that not necessarily shared with your partners.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really being able to say, okay, this thing now translates into this broader outcome, and you're kind of learning how to flex those muscles a bit to say, like, I'm still doing fundamentally the same thing I was doing before. It's not actually that different.
Nope.
It's just the way in which I'm preparing for that piece of research. Maybe it's taking more time because you're having a lot more conversations with people. You're probably having very different types of conversations with a broader audience of people. The way in which you're delivering your findings is probably very different because you're talking about them in a very different voice. You're not talking about them from description, cause, impact of your issue, which we've all been through. And it's always very important to be able to understand that base foundation, but it helps us to have a model for how we deliver those findings as well. If you have this approach going in, it allows you to cater that message to be easily understood on the outset.
Completely agree. In my experience, you're exactly right. This is how game development thinks. This is how game development companies as businesses think. They think about risks. They think about outcomes. They think about risk mitigation. They think about processes and conversations that make decisions that are more correct. And so you're absolutely right that this is an exercise in learning how to communicate better with people that are not researchers and don't think like you, but are in fact thinking about the business and that you're a part of and you're sort of partially responsible for. So yeah, I don't know if other disciplines other than games user research, I'm sure they do probably struggle to make this leap as well, moving from technical expertise to a sort of broader business expertise. But in my view, as you say, methods are an interesting lens on this. They are activities that reduce risk, but you have to have the wall, you have to have the enlightenment to be like, oh, okay, that's my job. I do things that reduce the likelihood that we're making a bad game. And that one mindset shift, I think, allows you to unlock, as you suggest, unlock more meaningful conversations with more varied stakeholders up and down the business, and actually win yourself credibility and trust from a broader spectrum of individuals.
100%. And I think what I want to make sure that anybody that's listening is taking into consideration as well, it's like you don't have to like wait to have this mindset until you have this really firm foundation, right? It's that even as maybe if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, okay, I want to level up my skills, or I want to maybe try and make sure I'm pushing my impact, but I'm maybe still early career, you can start to ask yourself some of these questions, start to think about how you're approaching these different conversations. And like you were just saying, thinking about the purpose.
Mhm.
Why are we here? Why are we delivering this information?
Mhm.
How are teams using it? What is going to be helpful for them? And starting to build this kind of instinct for yourself to really question that when you're preparing your research.
Mhm.
Maybe it doesn't fundamentally change because you're still learning and you're still trying to apply all of these like millions of pieces that we've chatted about, but catching yourself to think about maybe some of these different kind of voices and these different kind of buckets that you can think about, and how how am I going to get the information from my partners and being able to design this piece of research. Maybe you
Yes.
ask a couple of more questions. Maybe you take some time to really think through, what are the consequences of the method that I have chosen? Does
Mhm.
that still allow me to deliver the information that my team needs to help reduce that risk, to help
Mhm.
reduce that level of uncertainty that they are facing?
Mhm.
And starting kind of building that reflex can be a really great way, even if you're still fairly early career, right? When I had this kind of huge mindset shift, I was still fairly early in my career at this position
Mhm.
at UB, and I was still really trying to kind of put all those pieces together. But that was really the moment that like my entire approach changed,
Mhm.
because I really was thinking about, what is the outcome? Why is this important?
Mhm.
And how can I help people make more confident decisions and reduce that level of risk towards the decisions that need to be made?
Completely agree. I completely agree. So yeah, don't sit on your thumbs if you're a researcher thinking, I'd love to move my career forward, or think a bit more strategically. Uh, first of all, you can definitely write little project plans for like, oh, hey, I had a thought about, I'd love if we understood our players better. I'd love to, maybe we can run this piece of inspiration research. Nine times out of 10, that's going to be an instant no, but someone only needs to say once that, okay, we should entertain that idea. Moreover, you can definitely introduce a little bit of the other voices into all the research you're doing. Let's say we're doing, really iterative work, really, sprint to sprint work. How can I get a little bit of inspiration voice in there? How do I just talk a little bit about, one player's, maybe I find a player that's particularly passionate about this, or loves a game mode that we've subsequently discontinued, or I don't know. How do we add some inspiration to help these development teams not forget that, yes, I know we're interested in the fun score in level 10, but we're also interested in the people we're making games for, and
Yeah.
building the development team's intuition about these people and what they love about our product. Super easy to get like, can't see the wood for trees in these iterative tests of it. Actually, like, let's take a bit of a deeper breath, think about how we can learn a bit more about the people that are playing our games. And you could take examples from any of those four voices and just try and slot them into other aspects of research.
Yeah. I think it's super interesting because I think it's easy to kind of fall into this idea that I'm looking at everything in kind of a vacuum, or I'm looking at everything in kind of this one slice of this moment of time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to get carried away with, all right, I just need to do this one thing right now. And so it's kind of this moment where you're operating as a researcher and you're just constantly heads down,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm just doing this one thing right in front of me. And like they've asked me to do this one piece of research and I've taken the slice. But thinking through these different voices and these different kind of ways of that we can think about this research, it allows you and kind of forces you to take that step back
Mm-hmm.
to really think about the entire picture,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so easy to fall into the trap of like, this is an issue right here, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, is it?
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of force yourself to think about, yeah, maybe there's players that are discussing something that's really interesting, and you can share that information as a discussion, not being so locked into just like, this was the plan, this was the objectives, this
Hmm.
thing, this thing, this thing. It kind of helps you create this more flexible framework rather than like very rigid guidelines of things.
Completely agree. Completely agree. I think the more time you spend thinking about these decisions, these sort of outcomes, the more you'll get a sense for how individual departments contribute to them. So thinking about community management, for example, are super powerful in the sort of voice of the player in the boardroom, and influencing and getting some sense of, and in many ways inspiring the dev team. Like they're a really inspirational, a source of inspiration. They've got stories from players, fan art, they're sharing memes, they're gathering stories and influence from the player base and inspiring the development team. And so working out how to partner with those teams or work with them, understanding their place in the development process is super, super important, again, for getting, I think, a holistic
Yes.
picture of how games are made and how decisions are made inside this complicated organization.
Yes, 100%. I think community is such a phenomenal example of shared objectives
Mhm.
and shared goals of kind of how we want to be partnered and aligned with kind of the production partners, and
Mhm.
being able to look at how we can share resources, how we can share our approach, share
Mhm.
the way in which we're kind of thinking through, and leveraging, right? Like you said, they have a connection with a team that maybe we
Mhm.
won't always have. And so we can chat with them. Have you seen something like this? We want to approach our research in this way. And maybe you partner with them to talk to the community directly to offer some help in giving them some support in doing some research based on some of the accesses that they have, or being able to understand that there are people doing this type, maybe we can focus on something else and we can come together and take a multifaceted approach with these different voices and bring them together and help kind of drive that kind of influence and the impact that that individual piece could have.
So important, so important. Yeah, really, really beautifully put. Finding those allies and for the sort of greater good of the and because if they're not allies to some extent, they're adversaries, right? If you're not working with these folks, then you'll seem to be working against them, and so it's extremely important. uh, yeah, we're not the only voice of the player in the boardroom. I think it's
Yes.
extremely important to recognize that games user research is a voice, not the voice of the player in the boardroom. And so yeah, we've got to work out how to collaborate with other people to make sure that we're able, when push comes to shove, to to address some of these big validation pieces, for example, that we're using every tool in the toolkit. Okay, we're back
Yeah.
to methods now.
We've
We're
come
like
full
meta
circle.
methods. We're on meta
Do you
methods of
have
using
do you have
departments. And
final thoughts of what you want people to understand, or what you can share of how people can maybe apply these voices, or ways in which they can kind of start thinking about them?
yeah, of course. All right. So I guess the first point is about the importance of asking questions, not taking for face value what you're asked to do. Of course, being respectful of your development partners, making sure that you're, courteous and listening. That yes, okay, I understand this is your first thought on the kind of research that you want to do, but I'd love to just hear a bit more about the context of development and what you want to do with this data and what it's really for, and maybe talk a little bit about the other risks that there could be, and starting to imbibe the conversation, to own the conversation about what's the right thing we should do next. Within that, you're not limiting yourself to think about methods. This is not about the things that I know how to do or the things that I know have been done, but instead about risk mitigation, about having a really top-down view of why would this product not succeed? Why can this next feature, this next release, this next sprint, why would that not succeed in a very holistic sense? And if it's useful, using the model I described: inspiration, validation, acceleration, polish. Like, why are we here? What are we hoping to get from this research? If you do that, you can win better credibility. You can run more impactful research. You can be potentially more substantially influenced in making a better game. You can involve more of your peers and colleagues, which is exciting and fun and influential. And you'll also take your first steps in moving yourself away from being the games user research methods expert to being a insights leader, an influencer, a a trusted and powerful and passionate individual, trusted by your games studio or company, to have a holistic and trusted take on how these games are going to be made and what the teams are going to be doing, and that will get you across the chasm that exists in front of you as a methods expert, and give you some forward momentum and progression to be the best influence on game development that you can be.
I have nothing else to add to that. That was perfect. I love it. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I'm sure that we probably could have continued this conversation for many more hours. And if people want to hear us to continue this conversation for more hours, please let us know. We have many of other topics that we would like to chat about. So if anyone is curious for anything they want to hear more about, please let us know. I know that we would be more than happy to sit down again and continue and talk about other topics as well. So, Seb, thank you so much for
Absolute
your
pleasure.
time. We've been
Yeah,
talking for quite some time now, but I think it was really fantastic. Always a pleasure of kind of going through these things. And yeah, we will see everyone again for a future episode.
Super. Thanks so much. Have a good one.